So we have Adam Cormack, he's with Apprentice, and then Michelle Adkins from Emerson, and then Sachin Misra from Calypso. So you can come right on up if you want. So I'm very excited to talk about MES. Isn't this awesome? Particularly with this audience. I don't think we have very much of a chance to do this because I'm sure everyone here knows what a great reputation MES projects have, right? They always go perfect. They're always awesome. So let me, I'm going to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves because we're kind of coming from a little bit tangential here, but we're all trying to solve the same problem. So for me, I'm Mike Cody. I work for a company that's new. We haven't even had a formal launch yet. It's a soft launch. We're called Zether, pivoting specifically towards digital life science, consulting and advising of how do we bring some of these newest technologies, these newest practices that are really coming out now and in the past couple of years. How do we put them into practice? How do we actually get them deployed and turned on? So it's really exciting for me to be here. I've been working on these types of projects for nearly 20 years now. Michelle?
Sure. Hi, I'm Michelle Adkins. I have just changed roles, so I'm a director of our life sciences strategy now at Emerson, looking across the digital stack. Before that, I was leading our life sciences consulting team. I've been at Emerson for 18 years. Prior to Emerson, I worked for Merck for 13 years in instrumentation, automation support, manufacturing, and scheduling and planning.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sachin Misra. I'm a principal at Calypso, which is the digital business unit within Rockwell Automation. I lead our life sciences vertical. I've been in the industry for about 25 years. Worked with some of you, probably most of you in some capacity, and I'm responsible for delivering digital transformation to the pharma and biotech industry.
So, hi everyone, Adam Cormack. I'm a Director of Product Management at Apprentice, where we focus on providing a manufacturing platform, including MES and LES. Previously was at GE Healthcare before it got sold to Danaher and became Cytiva, and then also spent some time at Millipore-Sigma before moving to Apprentice.
Yeah, so I think as we get started, I wanted to kind of just set the stage a little bit here as far as like what our perspective is. I think we've talked a lot about digital transformation as a concept, and I think for me, when I look at it, it's not just about transformation, but there's a lot of disruption that's happening. I think that's been, when you go to these conferences and you talk to people, they're talking about the disruptive events such as the COVID pandemic, and then what happened after that, as far as how quickly we can get drugs through the approval cycle, how ATMPs are now starting to make a place for themselves within the market and within going to the FDA. I think another part of this that doesn't really get talked about as much is the disruption that's happening just purely from a digital perspective. There's a lot of talk about how people are asking more from their vendors to make changes and become more modern. I know that I've heard the term legacy be thrown out a lot, whereas 5 years ago, legacy was best in class. It was proven, it was known. There's a lot of things that new digital technologies have basically enabled all of us to do. I mean, it's a completely different landscape now, 5 years later. So with that, I think the way that we want to sort of run the session is to really have this be more of a Q&A. I think when we talked, as we sort of keyed some of this up and started it off, we talked about how people are in different swim lanes, in different silos. And I think for us who've been on sort of the manufacturing end, that are in manufacturing executions and in sort of operational technology systems, we're sort of a different side of the same coin when it comes to process knowledge and process development. I have a couple questions that I have ready to go, but if there's any questions from the audience, I'd much rather have this be a collaborative experience where we can kind of break down some of those silos. We'll start here. I don't even need to ask a question.
All right, so I'm going to start a fight. ISA 88. Thumbs up, thumbs down. What are we doing with it? It's a standard that has no body supporting it anymore. as far as I understand. I don't think there's a formal body that supports the standard anymore. Yet we're all kind of clinging on to this, and so I think I'm sure there's different perspectives on the stage, so I'm just going to throw it out there and let you guys go at it.
So, I guess I can start from me. The political answer, it's thumbs middle. I think with any standard, we're taking the pieces which make sense and help us create some standardization and some simplicity across the platform. But, does it make sense to treat ISA 88 as like a Bible and something you have to follow? And no, there's going to be certain parts of that standard which can be utilized across, and just certain parts which don't make sense to implement within the system because it's just too much effort. So I think it's more of a guiding light which people should look at to try and create some continuity, but it's not like we follow it to the letter, just in my personal experience.
Yeah, I would agree, Adam. I think it's a guiding principle, let's just say, but it doesn't mean you have to have a very strict interpretation of it. We try to support it as much as possible, specifically when it comes to a lot of the contract manufacturers that we support. They are on the, if you look at a vertically integrated, pharma innovator, they can somewhat manage the process of transferring that knowledge over to the execution side of the organization. But if you're a CDMO, you're potentially dealing with 10, 15, 20, hundreds of clients. And the number one thing they struggle with is the lack of consistency in terms of inbound recipes or tech transfers. So, the ISA 88, even though it's not really the Bible, if you will, it helps, and we try to support it as much as possible, but also remain flexible that with some of these new emerging modalities and therapies that you can't take a literal, strict interpretation of ISA 88.
I think when you come from the automation side, S88 has its positive attributes, and I think just being able to set the standard and have reusable objects and those kinds of things is very helpful in the manufacturing automation space. Now, when you start to get into the MES space, maybe it's a little bit of extra overhead that may not be required in all cases, and so that's where I have to agree with the thumbs middle from that perspective, because it depends on the application. It depends on what you're really trying to achieve and how much you want to standardize and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. I think Yash wanted to fight, so we should probably disagree in some way.
I'll provide I'll be the dissenting opinion but I'll pose it as a question. So I think in the last section, the last presentation room, we're talking about data, how you find data, how you look at data. I think S88 as a structure, it's taught as a standard, and you have to meet this quality standard of like this is how you have to define everything from your plant all the way down to an individual instrument. But really what it is, it's a way of creating some sort of foundational data model so that anybody, and it doesn't matter what technology you're using or how it's configured, if it follows the standard, you don't need to be trained on it. You don't have to work on it. You can go find it. And if you're a data scientist and you're trying to find information, it becomes self-service. Like it doesn't have to be built. So because I have a model. So in that type of context where we have people that are trying to look at data and then scrub it and clean it up so it can be used, is there a case for a model like S88?
I believe so. I think in the absence of any other comprehensive standard, right, we should use what we have available. And it's not that it's difficult to put in place. It's just people look at it as a legacy, right? And a lot of times the intent gets lost. But having said that, a lot of the newer technologies that we're developing does take a lot of the S88 constructs into consideration. I don't think it applies universally to every manufacturing modality that we're seeing in the market now. But once again, in the absence of something better, that's what we have. So yeah, same. But, middle thumbs, I would say.
I think just to add to that, I think a standard should never be 100% concrete because it limits the ability to innovate and create stuff. We spoke about CSV before. CSV has been around so long, everyone has their own interpretation of it, and that interpretation is not going to change until something new comes along. And I think that's the same with, SA88, we should follow it, and it should help create that level of standardization, but there should always be that level of flexibility so people can challenge it and, help us push forward and not fall, into having legacy systems which don't move forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good way to summarize that would be to say it's a tool. Use the tool for the appropriate application. It's not a rule that you have to always follow it.
So many of the folks in this room are maybe, air quotes, upstream of MES. So let's pick a fight in reverse. What would you say to them? What guidance would you give to them to help you guys out in the quote-unquote downstream from an information perspective?
Well, it's a good thing I haven't had a drink yet. Joking aside, as I mentioned before, a lot of my clients are CDMOs, so it's really acutely magnified because they have to deal with lots of different transfers. I think when I work with the other side of the equation with pharma innovators, the guidance that we give them is adopt a structure. It doesn't have to be S88, it doesn't have to be a particular standard, but just be consistent in your output so that your downstream partners, whether they're internal, external, or a network of partners, at least they understand what they should expect from those innovators. And I think the industry's gotten a lot better, right? So there is still, differences between what you would get, let's say, from a Pfizer versus what you would get from a Merck or an Amgen, but at least they're applying consistency to the transfers that are coming out, right? So I think my advice would be keep that up. I think the more consistency you can build into those templates or use a templatized approach, I think the execution side of the equation will be that much more effective and efficient in being able to scale up quickly.
And I think for putting the ATMP space aside, I think for traditional manufacturing, it's a very good tool. And it is a good rule to follow in those cases, a good standard to use. It's the communication across the silos can be more effective by using that tool.
Sure. I think I agree but build on it. I think it's almost like what can MES vendors do to help you? Because MES systems today neglect anything before commercial. There's a little bit of involvement in that pre-commercial, but it's very loose. And because of that, that generates this need to have peripheral systems. And then once you're ready to go to commercial, you have to collate all that data, you have to standardize it, and then move it into your MES. And we all know we're all human, we make errors, so that leads to a lengthy time. I think if we can create a flexible MES, because just to take a step back, if you look at what we're doing, we're all using the same thing. We're all using batches, we're all using procedures and materials. It's just different ways we use it. So if we can expand MES to cover that pre-commercial phase, and you can create this initial structure in the MES and then move it along the pipeline, that means that data is then consistent throughout that pre-commercial to commercial phase. So I think it's one thing having the data structure, but then you have to provide the tools to the scientists and the users to be able to implement that. And I think that's where MES maybe need to spread their influence a little bit further.
Yeah, I think just to build on that a little bit, in my experience, if you put MES in front of a process development engineer, they're going to laugh at you, right? Because it is not intended to serve that function. MES is a little bit further downstream and requires a lot of specificity and depth to be able to run manufacturing. The PD organization doesn't necessarily have that line of sight into what's going to happen in manufacturing. In fact, they might not even care, right? So they're building the process characterization, not knowing what facility it's going to be manufactured in, not knowing whether it's going to be really an internal endeavor or an external partner that does that. So to have them use MES to create the process models, every time I hear that, I just cringe. When somebody says, well, MES has recipe editing. Yes, it does for manufacturing, not for process development. So I think it's important to highlight that you have to look at the cultural aspects and really understand the tools that functional domain needs to be able to provide the outcomes and outputs that is, let's say, complementary to what MES needs. There's no expectation from PD that they will have a MES-ready recipe, 100% recipe ready to go, right? It's an input into the process, and then you build that up in MES. So I think that's part of what we need to all think about is, does the PD organization have the right tools to create that digital thread from pre-tech transfer all the way into manufacturing?
Right, and being able to ensure that you're capturing the process and knowledge management aspects in PD. What steps, what are the important parameters, what are the analytical methods and critical quality attributes for those steps and for your overall product. And then being able to transfer that in a way that's meaningful to the manufacturing space so that people are not taking information from spreadsheets or pieces of paper and then actually entering them and implementing them in other systems like MES or DCS, your process control systems, because that's an opportunity for error. It's an opportunity for error in introducing that into the commercial setting. And it wastes time because it's wasting people's time and doing meaningless tasks. And then somebody has to double check those tasks. So any opportunity that we have to be able to standardize and be able to bring that information in a mechanism that can be translated then from, say, that PD space into the commercial manufacturing space is going to enable us to bring products to market faster, be able to do tech transfer from one facility to another faster.
Yeah. And electronic does not mean digital, right? I've had a client that said, I produce PDFs and Word documents, that's digital, right? No, it's not, because there's no reusability there, right? Trying to integrate, a 50-page PDF document or a 100-page Word document into MES or into ERP, it's never going to happen. So I think that's the other kind of fallacy we need to help the industry kind of understand is, the industry's been doing this for decades, right? I'm going to throw over some documents, and it's going to characterize my process, my sampling methods, and everything that you need is in this document. Well, that's great. What does manufacturing do with it? They rekey the same information in multiple systems. So there's two aspects of it, right? One is exactly what you mentioned, the transcription transcription errors caused by humans. But more importantly, there's a data integrity issue, right? Every pharma company, every life sciences company out there, one of their key focus areas is ensuring and proving data integrity. Well, when you're sending PDFs and Word documents through tech transfer, you're not ensuring data integrity.
Yeah, question and comment maybe. You mentioned that if you put an MES in front of a PD organization, they're gonna, not be happy, right? And I agree. At the same time, what is the purpose of the PD organization, right? It's to develop a process that can actually be manufactured in the end, right? So if they have no line of sight what is actually needed in the end in something like an MES, right? Then there's a problem. But my question would be, how can you get that transition point earlier, right? And what are the MES manufacturing organizations doing to get this entry point maybe a little bit earlier, right? Into, maybe more clinical, right? To get that process, not we're throwing everything over the fence at one point, but how to ease that into, the commercial stage later on.
I think for me, it's two things. I think, first of all, the way MESs were originally developed is a very rigorous, very process-driven, it was all about the data, and it was never about the operator. So when you put that system in front of the process development person, they were like, holy, there's so much information here. So I think we need to take a leaf out of the book of other industries and make MESs more in the power of the scientists and the process development, and less needing an army of IT people behind them to support that process. Because by putting it in there, and if they feel that they have control over it and they feel like they can use it properly, then they're going to be more inclined to do it, and they're going to be more user-friendly. But to Sachin's point, we also have to provide a flexible MES, and I go back to the first conversation we had around SA88. We need to kind of apply that to MES standards as well. Like, if you're a clinical team, these are the guidelines we're going to follow you. We're not going to hold you to the same rigor as the commercial team. You know, if you're a commercial team, you can follow these guidelines. So I think by making MESs more approachable for the scientists and users, they're going to want to pick them up earlier because it's going to save them time, just in my experience.
Yeah, I think the pharma industry is not that different from other industries in terms of the methodology and process, right? And I kind of look at it as pre-tech transfer. Whether you're a scientist or in PD, you're really a creator. You're an author, so you have this creative spirit. And on the manufacturing side, post-tech transfer, it's all about execution, right? It's all about the discipline, the rigor, and it's a very different mindset. And I've delivered solutions in other industries. The one thing that's always struck with me is you cannot introduce that much rigor into the creative side of the process. I'm being very general here, but what that means is that whatever digital tools are in those creators, those authors' hands, has to be very attuned to how they actually work. The level of specificity and depth that's required from an MES solution is not something that a PD, someone in PD is going to care about. Maybe they should, and maybe it's a matter of taking existing MES solutions and putting a different user experience around it. Maybe it's a matter of giving PD enough of MES functions so they can get their job done, and then the rest is actually done by manufacturing. I think there's different ways to approach it. The point that I'm making is, culture and functional orientation has a lot to do with why MES doesn't really belong in PD. At least not the way MES is structured currently, right? Until it becomes very flexible, user-friendly. It's a web-driven application versus some legacy technology that's been built over the last 20 years. I think that the other piece I would mention too is there is a younger workforce out there, and there's expectations that they have, right? That you put a clunky MES in front of them, they don't want to use that system. They want to use something that operates like any other modern application. So that's another aspect of it that we as vendors, are actively working on. I don't know, Michelle.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in the process development space, it really is about development. And so, as you mentioned, you need that flexibility, you need that creativity. Maybe it's a different tool, really, that belongs in process development than MES, but then you need to be able to translate the information from process development to the commercial or the clinical manufacturing, whatever the case may be. And in process development, you're really, again, defining the process, defining the materials, defining the things that are important about that process, like a process and knowledge management type of tool.
Yeah, I think, so just in general, I want to I want to bring it back to why we're here. And I think one of the other presentations I saw, and I don't know if we can make this a thing, can we talk about that GMP path? That there's things that have to happen in drug discovery, in process development, because you don't know. We're talking about discovering knowledge. There's a lot of things we were talking about here when you go from discovery up until the point where really you're saying, this is my spec. This is the spec that I'm making. MES systems at their root, when they were first created, what they're trying to do, they're trying to enforce that anything that's happening on the shop floor is matching the spec.
Yep.
So if I'm making a widget, I want to make sure that every widget coming off the line is to spec, is exactly to spec. And I have my electronic batch record, it's not workflow. The electronic batch record is, yes, this thing that I made, it was the right material, there was the right spec, the right measurement, the right equipment, it was the right calibration history, the right use case, and the people that were involved in moving things around, the process part of it. I have it verified every single step along the way. So it's rigid. It forces you to be rigid because at that point, if you're shipping something, you want to make sure that it matches the spec. Now, unfortunately, in the traditional space and the paper space, we'll get a stack of like 1,000 pages. Like, here's the tech transfer document. Good luck. I hope it fits. And there's a gap there. And when we're trying to go fast, when we're trying to be nimble, we're trying to be agile, that just doesn't work anymore. So we have to have some way of putting these two places together where we can combine drug discovery along with how I'm creating workflow and how I'm going to then put those inputs into an MES.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. The light's glaring. You touched upon a lot of these things, but in the pre-lunch, post-lunch, you heard us talk a lot about platform approach. Is there a way that you can think of a platform approach, plug-and-play, modular building blocks that can define MES? So if it's new implementation for a new process, you can build from those libraries of building blocks for an easy execution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's really what you want to do in the PD space or in the process and knowledge management space. You want to define, okay, this is the type of bioreactor process step that I have, and these are the 2 different ways or 3 different ways that I might do it, and these are the parameters that are typically my critical process parameters and my critical quality attributes. These are the different control strategies. So then you have templates that you can use as a starting point. And then you're able to use that information because you have those templates as a translation as you move to the next step. And whether it's a paper report that gets spit out still because you're not quite ready for that translation yet, or if it's an electronic translation that actually can make it into your MES, then you're able to translate that, transfer that knowledge and that information so that people aren't manually entering that into the various systems.
The one thing that we've seen over the last few years is this notion of separating the general recipe from the site execution recipe, right? And that's been kind of a little bit of an olive branch, right? To say, PD, don't worry about the site specificity, right? Create that general recipe, define the equipment classes, define the critical quality attributes and the critical process parameters, but don't worry that I'm using, a Cytiva bioreactor here or and so on. So that's maybe another way to think about it. I've had a couple of clients that have adopted that approach of saying, we're going to put that clean separation in place because it's unfair to both manufacturing and PD that you're kind of commingling that activity, if you will. So that's been pretty successful, where we've seen, one general recipe generate, 30, 40 different variations depending on the number of market authorizations or number of sites that are manufacturing it. And it still conveys the intent of the science, if you will, but doesn't kind of constrain them to provide all this information that may not be relevant in that part of the life cycle. And hand that to MES, then go create your 20 different variated recipes to support, how you're going to manufacture it.
Yeah. Got to be careful. You're starting an S95 route there.
Yeah, I know. That's why I didn't use the word.
Just to build on that, I think it comes down to the concept of master data and being able to use that data across. But slight tangent, but related. I think in order to be able to truly utilize master data, we have to get away from this site-specific MES implementation and go to an enterprise MES implementation. So if you have that general recipe, you have the ability to tech transfer facility fit and say, okay, these are all my locations. Where is it best fit? So it's one thing having the data, but then you've got to kind of provide them the tools to utilize that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this internally in other forums. It's almost like you need to have the same revolution that MRP did when it transitioned to ERP, right? MRP was very site-specific, didn't really care about the enterprise, but it evolved to have more of an enterprise view, and then each site or organization rolled up, or each plant rolled up under that, so you could do centralized planning and sourcing and so on, right? That has never really caught up in the MES world, right? Every MES implementation is so site-specific that you have these 10-year rollout schedules. That doesn't work in today's world. So I think that's the next evolution that we see coming, is this notion of having centralized MES, but then being rolled out simultaneously or a lot faster than you would see these site-to-site implementations. I mean, I have clients that have been implementing MES for 6 years, right? Because they have so many plants, and it has to be done site by site. So I think that's the evolution to keep an eye on, is this notion of having cloud-based MES that creates this centralized governed structure or configuration, and then you can roll it out to any site at any time and very quickly scale them up.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a great question, because it kind of leads us into kind of like where do we think our side is going, like how manufacturing operations technology in general, like what direction you think it's going in? Because I hear I hear that, like I hear that type of question, and it's making its way up from the devices, like kind of, not to go back to S95, but if you're going up in levels, like each level is becoming more like service oriented. Meaning that if I'm truly plug and play, and it doesn't matter what vendor it is, and I can plug in that bioreactor, it should be plug and play in the sense that I can get data out of it quick, and I can orchestrate. I have somebody else is saying, I need you to run this process, and the device is going to do that. When you start talking about platform processes and building these libraries, suddenly your manufacturing operation systems, to me, start becoming more of a service to some other orchestration layer, something that's coming from the enterprise. So as long as my network of sites can do it, and they have that capability, then I don't have to do any site-specific configuration anymore. We haven't gotten the equipment part done yet, so it's kind of 2 or 3 leaps from there. But what do you guys think from a future perspective?
I mean, when we're thinking about futures, I mean, that's absolutely, I think, spot on. I think you're going to get more to a publish-subscribe model. You're going to have more stuff in the cloud. And in fact, in some cases, you might even not need some of the functionality that we have today, because let's take advantage of some of the other technologies that are out there, visual recognition, being able to watch an operator do something and say, is this set up properly, instead of somebody having to sign off something or follow those instructions, use augmented reality. I mean, there's so many things out there that I think the future is pretty bright in terms of the different things that we're going to see for the future of the manufacturing operations space.
Yeah, from our perspective, we think every manufacturing company is data rich, but information poor, right? So the contextualization of available data and making it available to the right persona at the right time, that's the evolution that we're seeing, right? And what it's really doing is blurring this notion of IT versus OT, right? There's always been this dividing line, right? I'm manufacturing IT. I only look after OT stuff, or I'm traditional IT. So that that line is blurring, because there's so much proliferation of data, both on the IT side and on the OT side. What we're starting to do is seeing this blending of information, right? So, for example, you may have a very structured knowledge management system that's defining the materials, the recipes, and so on. But once it's transferred over, once you go through the tech transfer process, there is no closed loop process today that feeds back what manufacturing is experiencing, feeding it back to the recipe originators to say, yeah, this is how you want to optimize it, because this is what your intent was, but to achieve that critical quality attribute, this is what I had to do to achieve that critical quality attribute. That feedback loop is very ad hoc and informal. What we're seeing now, some of the more progressive companies are saying, let's close that loop, right? We'll still keep the human in the loop, but we'll close that loop by analyzing these vast, huge amounts of data, turning it into information, and making it contextually available to the personas. And that doesn't mean that they're just personas in manufacturing. It's enterprise-wide. And that's the pivot that you're going to see, is this blurring of IT and OT to be more of a data-driven type of environment.
I would just echo both what they said, and I think they both play nicely together. I think one of the hot topics at the moment has been what we call redlining or in-suite authoring, the ability to make changes to the batch record on the go. And that's not possible today because everyone's working on the desktop. So you kind of got to go to the manufacturing floor. Okay, this is what I want to change, walk out, go. And that's why I think, to your point, it's where we have to start utilizing mobile technology, hands-free technology, which allow us to take that and become more modern. Because again, to your point, the workforce coming in, that's what they expect. They don't want to be at a desktop, on a website. They want that interactivity with the process.
Yeah, maybe at the end here, try to start another fight. But maybe also coming back to the original question here, accelerating MES implementations, right, with digital CMC, not so much maybe on the CMC, but the most acceleration would be if we don't have an MES, right? So where would you see, if you think about smart devices, smarter control layers, automation layers, right? Actually the chance to get rid of MES and not have MES, but kind of a self-documenting system.
Yeah, that's a very provocative question. It's actually been a debate among a lot of us. I've had a client, a younger client, let's just say, that basically said, why do I even need MES, right? MES should just go away, and we should just do everything at the DCS level, right? Because that has the ability to orchestrate and so on. And in some respects, he's probably right. And yeah, I think the thing to remember, though, is at the end of the day, you still have regulatory compliance, right? And MES will help you get the data that's needed from all those unit operations and batch processes so you can produce an electronic batch record. DCS isn't going to help you there, right? It's not going to produce that automated EBR, right?
Will FDA maybe want to see the data in real time?
And well, that's a lot of the work that we do is, getting real-time access to the data so you can see the dynamic state of the process, right? And a lot of that includes sensorization that has nothing to do with MES, right? It's standalone sensorization, or we're actually doing soft sensor calculations on the fly. So we're detecting moisture content without ever having to do anything with MES. And that predictive loop, if you will, is being delivered at the HMI level contextually to the operator, maybe not as a full closed loop, but as decision intelligence. The operator makes that final decision because the cost of validation in those types of situations is way too high, right? If you go look in food and beverage or in chemicals, they have closed loop autonomous systems all over the place, right? So I'll give you an example. We do a lot of work in the French fry industry, right? And French fries are something that are the quality of it is controlled by the temperature of the oil, the humidity in the environment, so on. There's lots of different factors. It's multivariate analysis. And we have a full closed loop system that we've implemented where it adjusts the process parameters automatically depending on what's happening in the environment, depending on the oil and so on. We don't do that in pharma, right? Because the cost of being able to prove that to a regulatory agency is exorbitant. Now, what I have seen is some of the more progressive companies adopt it at least in secondary manufacturing. So, it's very publicly known that Amgen uses a computer vision system for, their quality inspection process. So as the vials come through, they're taking high-speed, computer imagery, and they're analyzing the shape, color, distribution of the bubbles that are indicative of potential contaminants or particulate matter in the vials. And they had to go through quite a rigorous process to ensure that the model was not breaking the constraints or the parameters that were approved by the agency. Then they had to encrypt the algorithm to make sure nobody would tamper with the algorithm. Then they had to demonstrate to the regulatory agency that they have a strict change control process so that if they do update the algorithm, that there's traceability. That's a lot of overhead. Very easy to do in other industries, not so easy to do. So I think to answer your original question, until you get the regulatory agencies to adopt and endorse and sanction some of these types of things, unfortunately, MES isn't going to go away, right? There are other industries where MES is taking a little bit more of a backseat role because of those closed loop systems, but until that comes to the life sciences industry, it's going to be pretty difficult to displace that because of all the compliance requirements. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but hopefully I did.
So it's interesting, though, you touched on a few things, like Bioforms really working on some inline monitoring, real-time release,
Yep.
and how do we really get that to be more mainstream, adopted by the mainstream
Yeah.
folks, and moving it further upstream into the drug substance manufacturing as well. We're doing some proof of concepts or getting started on some of that as well in Bioform and in other places as well. And I think, looking down the pike to the future, I think it's going to happen.
It's a matter of time.
It's just a matter of time, and some of those difficulties that you're describing or explaining, it's gonna happen.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think you can, what you mentioned, like I think we all have heard it, because it also challenges our way of thinking. And I like to say that about any plant floor system. So if you're quality control lab, you could say the exact same thing. Why do I have a LIMS system? Like, why do I really need that? Any assay that they're running, anything they're doing against the batch, I mean, it's part of a sample plan, and that sample plan is tied to a production order that comes down from SAP or whatever your ERP system is. But there's that fundamental model that however I'm manufacturing the widget through the plant, if there was a way for any operator at any time to have the information they need to progress the batch forward, I don't need to replicate models down to my different labs, like either a lab system or a CMMS, like EAM system, or my manufacturing execution system. Like all of these three-letter acronym systems are all built to fit a purpose in your plant. But yeah, if I had some way to abstract out their tasks so they could be these like autonomous, if it's truly IoT and that device or that node is kind of self-fulfilling. It knows where it is within the enterprise. Yeah, I don't need these orchestration systems to make sure everything line up. It's a good vision, but it's hard to get to.
Look. Do you absolutely need MES to do this? No, in the strictest sense, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a lot of data collection. And the two operative words are evidentiary proof, right? So meaning if you get audited, you have a bad batch, or you have an adverse event of some sort, you have to produce that evidentiary proof or you'll just get shut down, right? That's part of why you need these orchestration systems in place, is to make sure that that specification that was developed is something that you are adhering to. And by the way, you're recording that data. So if you do get audited, for any number of batches going back any number of years, you can produce that and say, yes, here's my evidentiary proof that I remained within control. My process, did not have exceptional variation. That's one of the big drivers of MES in life science. I mean, it's to support that regulatory requirement.
I think. Sorry,
I was just going to say it really is the evidence that you did the right thing at the right time, with the right piece of equipment in the right state, the right material that's still released, and all those things. If there's another way to capture that or do that, then fine. But right now it's MES.
I think that's where I'd summarize that. I don't think it's a replacement; it's an evolution. I think the conversation is based on MES, how it is today, but as these new tools, as these new features work out, we need to continually evaluate how MES plays into that. Maybe it doesn't need to play this center brainchild to the whole manufacturing process as it does today. Maybe it can take a back seat, like you said, in some industries, but I think it's always going to be there. We just, as industry leaders, need to be aware of how everything else is evolving and then tailor the MES approach to fit in, so it's not just another system on the manufacturing line.
So I want to pile on something that was brought up earlier. So he was basically saying that when you show MES system to someone from PD, right, that they wouldn't understand the complexity and this kind of stuff. So could you comment, because I think part of this discussion is also that it's digital CMC, right, on the capabilities of QBD Vision being that transition layer or translation layer between PD and manufacturing, and maybe also the integration or feeding the MES systems with the required information.
Yeah, I think, in our experience, you need those intermediary or transition type of tools, not just because of the cultural aspects, right, that the user experience and the process is very different, but also that it needs to be supportive of what manufacturing's expectations are, right? So if you go back even 20 years, every tech transfer I lived through was PDFs or Word documents, and I know guys that lost their hair or got really gray hair. I mean, that's part of where my gray hair comes from. Is just trying to figure out, what did you mean? What does this assay really mean, right? So there's that back and forth that happens, because no tech transfer happens immediately. It's an iterative process, right? You didn't give me this, I didn't understand this, and that back and forth happens, and you can't do that with paper. You can't do that with PDF. That's why a tech transfer process takes 18 months, right? I think when you look at tools like QBD Vision, they fit that slot, that transition zone of saying, I will let you model your processes and your data using the ontology and the taxonomy that you're intimately familiar with, and I will, I'll orchestrate the propagation of that scientific knowledge and information in a very structured way to MES. And by the way, that'll never be 100% complete recipe anyway, right? I would say if you can do 40% of the information is reusable, you're probably, better off than most people. But I mean, I think that's the reason why you have, tools like QBD Vision and others, is they've recognized that the transition from development into manufacturing is not just it's not just a flip of a switch, right? There's a lot of collaboration and intent that needs to be structured.
Agree. Yeah, so I have a question. All of that has been educative to me because I'm an outsider, so I have been educating. Like I know that pharma people likes to make fights. This is new to me. And as well that the pharma agents like to wear brown shoes, all of them. So the thing that I'm trying to get in, like Dan mentioned yesterday that we are trying to swim across the swim lanes. And as an engineer, I heard a lot of common problems, like the silos, like the digital transformation, like the data structure, stuff like this. But Sajjan, like you said, that example of the French fries. But when it comes to like making this computer vision system, it took more time and it was like hard. But there seems like a light by the end of the tunnel that they were able to make it. Like they were able to make a computer vision system that checks the vials with the bubbles and stuff like this. So I mean, it seems I heard like common problems, but not a common solution. But what you said, it seems like a solution, but it took more time to get to. So can someone repeat that process and maybe automate parts of it till it's be something like a common solution to something like that? That's what I had in mind. Like, it's a solution. What you meant is it maybe have taken more time to implement, but it's something. So why you guys don't capitalize on such things, automate things through the way and be able to prove something?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is that there's, especially in this industry, there's many stakeholders, right? It's not just manufacturing, it's not just supply chain, it's not just quality, it's not regulatory, it's, there's probably, 20 different stakeholders that all have to be on the same page, right? And that doesn't necessarily happen in this industry, right? I mean, I'm from the industry, so I can kind of call ourselves out, but this is the worst industry for silos, right? The one thing this industry does really well is go very deep, right? There's a lot of deep domain depth and experience, but it doesn't flow horizontally, right? It's very vertically oriented. And that's the number one reason from a digital transformation perspective, unless you have a very, charismatic leader that is able to pull every one of those stakeholders together and basically champion why they should do it and what the value to that organization is, it'll never happen. Right? I've worked with lots of different pharma companies where it's like pulling teeth. It's pulling teeth to get quality to agree with what supply chain wants to do or what manufacturing wants to do with regulatory and so on. But that's the simple answer. The simple answer is there's too many functional silos and too many stakeholders that don't necessarily have the same vision.
And I think even when you get that agreement, which takes ages, then the length of time to actually implement it is, just as long because of the conversation we had around CSV, CSA. The pharmaceutical industry are very risk adverse. They're not willing to make changes. There's a lot of risk assessment, analysis, time, but then that costs money. So while you're doing all that risk assessment, you're spending less time on manufacturing and, especially the capacity crunch we're in. So it's just a lot of red tape, I would say, which slows us down.
Yeah, and it's not just about the technology, like you mentioned. I mean, organizational change management is a big piece of it. It's about people and culture and processes. So if you don't make the processes simple and easy for someone to follow, they're not going to follow them just because the technology is there. If the culture is not there to say, this is the way we're going to do things, and we want to collaborate, and we have a collaborative culture versus our silos, and this is the way I'm going to run my business, I want collaboration, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think I'm going to tell one of my favorite stories, and it might illustrate the point. Because I think when you go from paper to digital, like you lose some things. So in a paper world, if you have a tech transfer document, you'll have a bunch of manufacturing staff that are responsible for writing. I mean, really, it's thousands of documents, whether it be SOPs or forms or batch records, whatever it is. I was working on a project once, working with really, really, really sharp. She was manufacturing manager, implementing an MES solution for the first time. And we sit down to talk about how they were going to handle support services, so buffer, media prep for upstream, downstream processes. And I just sat down, I laid out a floor plan. I said, so tell me how you want this to operate. Like, how do you envision this working? Like, do you formulate in bulk? Do you bulk concentrate and then sub-batch? Do you do one-to-many, one-to-one? Like, give me a little bit of a description about how this is going to work. And she looked me square in the eye and said, oh, well, that's why we have an MES system, right? The MES system will just take care of that. And she said it with full faith that was the right answer. And we're, from a technology perspective, we're like, well, yes, your MES system can do that, but we need to configure it to do that. We need what are our rule sets? What's important there? And I think sometimes when we take these leaps to these tools that have a lot of promise, and we can see the value, we start missing some of these places where there needs to be some leadership in making some of those decisions, which is great. Like coming back to things like QBD Vision, like here's a place where I'm defining it up front. We're all looking at the same piece of information from all of our different sort of stakeholder positions. And if I had this during that conversation, I wouldn't have had to even ask the question. I know what needs to happen.
I think we need to convince everyone to buy QBD Vision.
Good?
We're good at time, too.
Sure.
Thank you.